Welcome back to another video. Today's video will be part 4 of my 5-part series I'm doing my book, which is titled Studies in Quranic Language and Exegesis. Part 1, 2, and 3 are already uploaded on my channel, so if you would like to take a look at those, you can. You do not have to watch those videos to get an understanding of what we are going to be talking about today, but it would help my channel a lot if you would. With that being said, this video will revolve around the thesis that the Quran constantly borrows from pre-existing religions, folklore, fables, and myths, specifically dealing with pre-Islamic narratives, myths, and rituals within Islam that existed within Islam and has been preserved by Islam. Since this topic is much more open and less defined as our last topics, and we have a lot to cover, I would like to get into it straight away. So with that being said, we can now pivot to one of the most prime examples of this adoption. Take, for example, the Infancy Gospels, a collection of fables that were fabricated in the name of the apostles of Jesus Christ, centuries after their deaths. Before I start citing the similarities, I have to make mention that the entire first half of both Surat Miriam and Surat Ali Imran, from verses 1 to 63, are completely infested with New Testament apocryphal writings. Take, for example, the scholar Gabriel Said Reynolds, who pointed out in his book, written in 2018, The Quran and the Bible, Text and Commentary, that the Quran borrows directly from the Infancy Gospels, a collection of late New Testament apocryphal writings that are widely discredited as heresy in Christian tradition, and is admitted to be some sort of fabricated legend by numerous scholars. A prime example for it to be discredited comes from early church authorities, as it was condemned by Pope Innocent I in 405 AD, and later classified as apocryphal and to be avoided by Catholics in the Galatian Decree around 500 to 553 AD, which was a council that took place roughly 17 to 70 years before the birth of Muhammad. The council makes a firm declaration about the Infancy Gospels, boldly stating, not merely rejected, but eliminated from the whole Roman Catholic and Apostolic Church, and with their authors and the followers of its authors to be damned in the inexorable shackles of anathema forever. Back to our scholar, Gabriel Said Reynolds, professor of Islamic Studies and Theology, and his aforementioned book that was published by Yale University Press, that makes a notable mention on the comparison between the beginning of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas and the mention of Jesus Christ making birds out of clay in the Quran. Take, for example, Quran chapter 349 and chapter 5110. 349 goes as follows, "And make him a messenger to the children of Israel, saying, I have come to you with a sign from your Lord, that I determined for you, out of dust, the form of a bird. Then I breathe into it, and it becomes a bird, with Allah's permission. And I heal the blind and the leprous, and bring the dead back to life with Allah's permission. And I inform you of what you should eat and what you should store in your houses. Surely there is a sign in this for you, if you are believers." 5110 goes, "The day when Allah will say, O Jesus, son of Mary, remember my favor upon you and upon your mother, when I supported you with the pure spirit, and you spoke to the people in the cradle and in maturity, and remember when I taught you the writing of wisdom and the Torah and the gospel, and when you designed from clay what was like the form of a bird with my permission. Then you breathed into it, and it became a bird with my permission. And you healed the blind and the leper with my permission. And when you brought forth the dead with my permission. And when I restrained the children of Israel from you, when you came to them with clear proofs. And those who disbelieved among them said, This is naught but obvious magic." Compare these passages with the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, where Jesus Christ makes birds out of clay. The beginning of it goes as follows. This child Jesus, when 5 years old, was playing in the ford of a mountain stream. And he collected the following waters into pools, and made them clear immediately. And by a word alone he made them obey him. And having made from soft clay, he fashioned out of it 12 sparrows. And it was the Sabbath when he did these things. And there were also many other children playing with him. And a certain Jew, seeing what Jesus was doing, playing on the Sabbath, went off immediately, and said to his father Joseph, Behold, your son is at the stream, and has taken clay, and has made of it 12 birds, and has profaned the Sabbath. And Joseph, coming to the place, and seeing, cried out to him, saying, Why do you do on the Sabbath what is not lawful to do? And Jesus clapped his hands, and cried out to the sparrows, and said to them, Off you go! And the sparrows flew, and went off crying. And the Jews, seeing this, were amazed, and went away, and reported to their chief men what they had seen Jesus doing. Firstly, I do see a fit to make mention that it was not a surprise to me when I made discovery of how Muhammad first came across these stories, mainly due to the literary style of how the Quran presented these miracles being done by Allah's permission, as if the Quran was responding to some sort of divinity claim being made on Christ's behalf. As many historians have pointed out that similar stories have been presented to argue a similarity of how God has made Adam, as even in the Quran, Allah himself is portrayed doing the very same thing as Jesus in making Adam out of clay and breathing into him the breath of life. Quran 15:26-29. With that being said, it was not a surprise to see that these stories were first presented to Muhammad by a group of 60 Christians from Najran, where Gnostic stories like the infancy Gospels would flourish, and were all well known by the 5th century. Evidence would be in the fact that the Christians from Najran brought the very same human-forged stories for lines of argumentation for the divinity of Christ, that the Quran endorsed as divine fact, but argues that these miracles were done on Allah's leave. And in my opinion, and I do feel quite confident in this assertion, is that these very infancy Gospels and similar stories are the direct source for the content of Jesus Christ in the Quran. A polemicist could point to the fact that even Ibn Kathir, who is one of the most authoritative scholars in Sunni Islamic history, makes note of these events transpiring within his very own tafsir on 361, where Muhammad attempts to lay a curse, mubahala, on whoever is telling a lie on the matter of Jesus, and offers to lay some sort of death curse upon himself and his close relatives, from his daughter to his grandchildren, alongside his son-in-law, Ali. With that aside, the Christians who visited Muhammad presented these specific stories for proof of their claims that Jesus was divine. Indeed, these are the creeds of the Christians, that they claim Isa is God, since he brought the dead back to life, healed blindness, leprosy, and various illnesses, told matters of the future, created the shape of birds, and blew life into them, bringing them to life. However, all these miracles occurred by Allah's leave, so that Isa would be a sign from Allah for people. They also claim that Isa is the son of Allah, since he did not have a father, and he spoke when he was in the cradle, a miracle which had not occurred by any among the children of Adam before him. I do want to make mention that the very stories that these Christians presented during their debate were thoroughly denounced as heresy in the Galatian decree, around 130 to 135 years prior to this visit. The council boldly declared that whoever follows these stories are to be anathematized, and I quote, "the followers of its authors to be damned in the inexorable shackles of anathema forever." That being said, I do want to make mention that Ibn Kathir also notes that Surah Al-Imran was deliberately revealed from the beginning of its content all the way up to verse 61 as a response to the Christian stories. Yet, the Quran seems to adopt them as divine fact, as if its author is only concerned with whether or not Jesus was permitted to do these miracles by Allah's authority. The reason for the call to Mubahala and the revelation of the ayat from the beginning of this surah until here is that a delegation from the Christians of Najran in Yemen came to Al-Madinah, the Medina, to argue about Isa, Jesus, claiming that he was divine and the son of Allah. Allah sent down the beginning of the surah until here, verse 61, to refute their claims. These factors come with a conclusion that shows a clear and persistent context of how the Quran quite literally treated human-forged stories as divine fact, as these stories came from heretics and successfully anathematized themselves during their time spent with the Prophet, as they presented heretical forged stories that were thoroughly condemned by the church prior to their visit, and Muhammad merely adopted their tall tales as divine literature, presenting each of their stories in his very own Quran. To exemplify this, I will compare 3 of the aforementioned notes. 1. We are told that in Ibn Kathir's tafsir, the creeds of the Christians was that Jesus is God, since he brought the dead back to life, healed the blindness, leprosy, and various illnesses, told matters of the future, created the shape of birds, and blew life into them, bringing them to life. Ibn Kathir continues to say that these Christians also claim that Isa is the son of Allah, since he did not have a father, and he spoke when he was in the cradle. Now compare these stories that the Christians presented and the creeds themselves with the Quran's passage 5110, where the creeds and the stories themselves of the Christians are directly treated as divine fact, only asserting that the miracles had occurred on the authority of Allah. The day when Allah will say, "O Jesus, son of Mary, will you remember my favor upon you and upon your mother when I supported you with the pure spirit, and you spoke to the people in the cradle," that's one of their creeds right there, "and in maturity. And remember when I taught you writing and wisdom, and the Torah and the gospel, and when you designed from clay what was like the form of a bird with my permission. Then you breathed into it, and it became a bird with my permission." That is the second creed that the Quran affirmed from them. "And you brought forth the dead with my permission," another creed of theirs. "And I restrained the children of Israel from you when you came to them with clear proofs. And those who disbelieved among them said, 'This is naught but obvious magic.'" You can also find the creeds of the Christians presented in Quran 19:29-33, where it says, "So she pointed to the baby. They exclaimed, 'How can we talk to someone who is an infant in the cradle?' Jesus declared, 'I am truly a servant of Allah. He has destined me to be given the scripture and to be a prophet. He has made me a blessing wherever I go, and bid me to establish prayer and give alms tax as long as I live. And to be kind to my mother, he has not made me arrogant or defiant. Peace be upon me the day I was born, the day I die, and the day I'll be raised back to life.'" Again, Jesus speaking as a baby in the cradle, adopted straight from the creeds of the Christians. Anyways, it would be smart to underline that it would be extremely hard to prove that these Christians, quote unquote, consciously identified with a particular sect, as Najran had various Christian schools of thought. But what is quite verifiable is that the miracle traditions that the Christians from Najran presented had already been condemned by the church, and yet they are treated in the Quran as historical fact, albeit with a revised theological explanation. Moving on from the constant influence of the infancy gospels, to make a short note on how the Quran is somewhat of a reflection of Tatian's very own diatessaron, considering on how the Quran treats the Injil, the Arabic form for gospel, which is derived from the Greek word evangelion, good news or gospel. The diatessaron itself, it was composed by the pupil of Justin Martyr, Tatian, and written around the 2nd century. The book became the standardized text of Edessa and Syriac Middle East as the dominant gospel text in the pre-Islamic Arabian environment where Islam emerged. The text itself was a single coherent gospel narrative where it harmonized the 4 gospels into one continuous account. I do have to point out that its influence was inevitable, as it was the dominant and standardized text for gospel preaching and teaching within and outside of churches by the 5th century in the regions where Islam flourished, which plausibly explains its influence in the Quran. Proof of this influence would be in the fact that the Quran itself treats and refers to El-Injil as a single book given to Jesus rather than the 4 separate canonical Gospels, which is a similarity that I find too striking to be overlooked within this video. Another striking adoption is the complete submission that Muhammad had with the concept of the evil eye, a certain curse that throughout many cultures in ancient history have had their very own version of, and this, however, was most surprising to me, as I was quite familiar with the myth, as it predates Islam by a millennia and appears in nearly every ancient culture from Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, India, and apparently to the Pre-Islamic or Arabs during Muhammad's time. Proof of this would be in the fact that Amina bint Wahab, Muhammad's very own mother, used, and I quote, spells to rid Muhammad from the influence of the evil eye when he was a child, as Muhammad was only 6 years old when Amina died. Ali Halabi, in his Turkish work entitled Isanil Uyun, informs us that many people declare that Amina, Muhammad's mother, used the spell in order to recover him from the influence of the evil eye. That line was taken directly from the biography of Muhammad, written by Ali Halabi, who was a 16th century scholar from Aleppo, Syria, renowned for his comprehensive biography of the Prophet Muhammad. The reason that this is so compelling is that I would have said that Muhammad's mother's beliefs would have influenced Muhammad profoundly. But it was profoundly shocking to me to find out that the entire pre-Islamic Arabic world that surrounded Muhammad were all somewhat endorsing this belief. A prime example would be found in the fact that when Muhammad started receiving revelation, all his companions all feared that he was suffering from the evil eye, and even took measures to protect themselves against him, as I will demonstrate later on. Ibn Ishaq says that before revelation first began to descend upon him, Muhammad's friends feared that he was suffering from the evil eye, and that when it came upon him, almost the same illness attacked him again. The superstition was so immensely believed that Muhammad's friends even took precautions, as they wouldn't even raise their glance towards him, in fear of themselves retaining the evil eye, when he first began to receive revelation. On the authority of Amr ibn Sharbil, it is stated that Muhammad said to Khadija, "When I was alone, I heard a cry, 'O Muhammad, O Muhammad.' In tradition, it is stated that he said, 'I fear lest I should become a magician, lest one should proclaim me a follower of the jinn.' And again, 'I fear lest there should be madness or demoniac possession in me.' After an ascension of shivering and shutting his eyes, there used to come over him what resembled a swoon. His face would foam, and he would roar like a young camel." Abu Hurairah says, "As for the apostle of God, when inspiration descended upon him, no one could raise his glance to him until the inspiration came to an end. In tradition, it is stated that he was troubled thereat, and his face foamed, and he closed his eyes, and perchance roared like the roaring of a young camel." This assertion comes directly from the way that the sentence is structured, as it seems that the superstition that had developed seems to evoke itself directly to how the Greeks treated the evil eye. Take, for example, the Greek historian and philosopher Plutarch, who lived around 4 to 5 centuries before Muhammad, who himself wrote of the evil eye, as he was an avid believer of the curse. This, of course, would show us how people would treat the superstition during his time. You know very well that it is commonly supposed that some have friends, acquaintances, and even fathers that have such evil eyes, so that the mothers will not show their children to them, nor for a long time suffer them to be looked upon by such. And how can the effect wrought by these proceed from envy? Notice how in both cases, friends and relatives would not raise a glance towards the afflicted as a means of protection from what both parties sought as a curse that would arise from jealousy or envy. Plutarch himself asserted that it was merely possible to cause harm by a mere glance of an eye, and I do believe that early Muslims during Muhammad's time subscribed to this belief. Now, when men thus perverted by envy fix their eyes upon another, and these, being nearest to the soul, easily draw venom from it. and send out as it were poisoned darts. It is no wonder in my mind if he that is looked upon is hurt. Proof of this claim will be in the fact that the Quran itself endorses such superstition. Take for a prime example where Muhammad believes that his bystanders are casting spells on him with their looks. 6151 goes, the disbelievers would almost cut you down with their eyes when they hear you recite the reminder and say, he is certainly a madman. I do see it fit to make mention that even modern translators prescribe the use of evil eye in this passage. Take, for example, what he did in Khan. They would almost cause you to stumble with their evil eyes. Musraf bil Hussein. They would strike you down with their evil eyes. I do want to make another slight note that Ibn Kathir, who is the most authoritative and most renowned scholar for Quranic exegesis, points out that this passage is a clear proof for the evil eye. So it even seems that later Muslims were quite familiar with the curse and its involvement with Islam. Ibn Abbas, Mujahid, and others have said would make you slip in order to have some effect on you with their eyes, meaning they will affect you by looking at you with their eyes. The evil eye. This means they are jealous of you due to their hatred of you, and were it not from Allah's protection of you, defending you against them, then their evil eye would harm you. The effect of the evil eye is real. In this ayah is a proof that the effect of the evil eye and its affliction by the command of Allah is real. I do want to point out that the explanation behind the evil eye that Ibn Kathir gives is too similar to Greek/Roman myths, as he prescribes the curse to be a result of a gaze, of envy or jealousy, which is most damning because of the weight behind such a proclamation of belief, as this superstition was taken in its most literal sense in the Quran, and as I will demonstrate later on, even made its way into hadiths, prescribing even modern Muslims to believe in such paganism. Take, for example, the hadith that is on the authority of Ibn Abbas. The influence of the evil eye is a fact. If anything would precede the destiny, it would be the influence of an evil eye. And when you are asked to take a bath as a cure from the influence of the evil eye, you should take a bath. Here it seems that Muhammad has prescribed that washing oneself is a cure for the influence of the evil eye, and that Muhammad has implied that the influence of the curse was a real thing. Another striking hadith is where Muslims seem to be so worried of this influence and of its harm that they start entertaining the idea that the evil eye should be treated as an illness, and they should be performing ruqya for the influence, which is the prescribed practice of treating illness through Quranic recitation. It was narrated that Ubayd bin Rafi'a Azraqi said, Azma, O Messenger of Allah, the children of Jafar have been afflicted by the evil eye. Shall I recite ruqya for them? He said, yes, for if anything were to overtake the divine decree, it would be the evil eye. Here it seems to imply that other children of the ancient Islamic world were influenced by the curse, just as Muhammad had been when he was a child. On that note, I would like to point out that Amina was not the only one using spells for curing the curse, as aforementioned, but sources suggest that the entire early Muslim world was some sort of sorcerous community, using and casting spells and enchantments for make-believe curses. Prime examples will be found in these hadiths. Narrated in Imran ibn Hussein, the Prophet said no spell is to be used except for the evil eye, or a scorpion sting. Or this hadith where it says that Aisha reported that a Jew from among the Jews of Banu Zariq casted a spell upon Allah's messenger, with the result that he, under the influence of the spell, felt that he had been doing something, whereas he had not been doing that. This state of affairs lasted until one day or one night Allah's messenger, may peace and blessings be upon him, made supplication to dispel its effects. A Muslim might attempt to say that these spells are merely just Quranic recitations or prayers, but such claims will be put to halt once you consider the aforementioned quote where Amina herself were using these spells to rid Muhammad of the influence when he was a child, and when there were no Quranic verses to recite from, due to the fact that Muhammad was a child and Islam was not yet a thing. Ali Halabi, in his Turkish work entitled As-Sanul Uyun, informs us that many people declare that Amina, Muhammad's mother, used a spell in order to recover him from the influence of the evil eye. On that note, it is time to establish a conclusion, as numerous quotations have been presented, but their collective significance has yet to exemplify the influence that this superstition had. I myself attribute it to a cancer that grew undetected, until it was so thoroughly integrated into the religion that its foreign nature was no longer recognized, as if the superstition that surrounded Muhammad's world prior to his revelation successfully infested itself into Islam, like a parasite, treated as divine revelation, despite its pagan origin. I'd say that there's no means to pretend that there's not a reality within Islam borrowing from pre-Islamic pagan practices that flourished around Muhammad's birthplace, as Muhammad was born in Mecca, a well-documented commercial and religious trading hub, where many pagan cultures, beliefs, and superstitions converged. One of the biggest practices that integrated into Islam from the pagan environment of Mecca was the Kaaba itself. Muhammad personally conquered the structure into the Islamic religion, making claims that it was built by none other than Abraham and his son Ishmael. And remember when Abraham raised the foundation of the house with Ishmael, both praying, "Our Lord, accept this from us. You are indeed the all-hearing and all-knowing." In reality, the Kaaba itself prior to Islam functioned as a pagan sanctuary, housing no less than 360 idols that Muhammad himself destroyed. The Prophet entered Mecca. At that time, there were 360 idols around the Kaaba. He started stabbing the idols with a stick he had in his hand and reciting truth. Islam has come and false disbelief has vanished. It did not only function as a pagan sanctuary, but also served as a hub for trade, which also competed with other trade sites that had similar structures. Take, for example, the aforementioned House of Dul Khalaza, Yemenite Kaaba. Jarir bin Abdullah narrated there was a house called Dul Khalaza in the pre-Islamic period, and it was also called Al-Kaaba al-Yamaniya or Al-Kaaba al-Shamiyya. Allah's messenger said to me, "Will you relieve me from Dul Khalaza?" So I left for it with 150 cavalrymen from the tribe of Ahmas. And then we destroyed it and killed whoever we found there. Then we came to the Prophet and informed him about it, and he invoked good upon us and upon the tribe of Ahmas. The Dul Khalaza was not alone, as many historians point out that Najran, a significant region in southern Arabia, where diverse cultures, including a substantial Christian community with various sects, had converged, had a Kaaba of their very own, famously mentioned in the Book of Idols, Kitab al-Islam, by Hisham bin Ibn al-Kalbi. The Kaaba of Najran. The Banu Qarith ibn Kayab had in Najran a Kaaba which they venerated. It is also true that these structures serve the purpose for idol worship, directed to pagan deities. And it is also true that building houses for these deities was a common practice. Take, for example, the fact that the Quran makes mention of two idols called Alat and Uzza. Now, have you considered the idols of Alat and Uzza? Quran 53:19. These two idols had their very own Kaabas, as Ibn Kathir makes this point abundantly clear in his tafsir. Refuting idolatry, Alat and Al-Uzza, Allah, the Exalted, rebukes the idolaters for worshipping idols and taking rivals to him. They built houses for their idols to resemble the Kaaba. Have you then considered Alat? Alat was a white stone with inscriptions on it. There was a house built around Alat in At-Taif with curtains, servants, and a sacred courtyard around it. The people of At-Taif, the tribe of At-Takaf, and their allies worshipped Alat, quite similar to the Kaaba in Al-Haram or in Mecca. Then you have the Kaaba of Sindad. The Ad had another Kaaba in Sindad, located in the region between Al-Kufa and Al-Basra. All these structures serve the same purpose as the Meccan Kaaba, as I already established that the Meccan Kaaba had 360 idols within it prior to Muhammad destroying them. This establishes that the Kaaba in Mecca was one of many local sanctuaries, not unique or special in any way, shape, or form. It was only rebranded by Muhammad to be some sort of ancient building built by Abraham and his son Ishmael, without any pre-Islamic evidence to support the claim. The evidence shows quite the contrary. Realistically, the Kaaba was a pre-Islamic pagan sanctuary pilgrimage site, and not unique in any way, shape, or form, as it was one of many cubical shrines, Kaabas, scattered across Arabia. There is no evidence in my mind to support that there was anything exceptional or extraordinary about the Kaaba in Mecca. However, it was more successful than its adjacent neighbors, but that is only because Muhammad had conquered and rebranded the structure and destroyed its relatives, thus erasing them out of history. Winners make history, losers don't. The Kaaba had been a primary religious structure for Islam, despite its foreign pagan background, and was adapted directly into Muhammad's religion. Some of the ceremonial practices that had predated Islam that significantly revolved around the Kaaba had even made their way into the Islamic religion. Pre-Islamic Arabs had already performed tawaf or made circles around the Kaaba and other Kaabas as a standard pagan tradition. Even Muslims themselves were quite skeptical of the idea, as they were well acquainted with the pagan concept of circling cubic structures. Narrated Asim, I asked Anas bin Malik, did you used to dislike to perform tawaf between Safa and Marwa? He said yes, as it was of the ceremonies of the days of pre-Islamic period of ignorance, till Allah revealed, verily the two mountains of As-Safa and Al-Marwa are among the symbols of Allah. It is therefore no sin for him who performs the pilgrimage to the Kaaba, or performs Umrah to perform Tawaf between them. Tawaf was not the only ceremony that Islam took from its pre-Islamic pagan predecessor, as Kiswa, the covering the Kaaba, was taken from pagan roots. The practice of covering important holy buildings or structures with cloth, sheets, or curtains was not unique to the Middle East, but to shorten this video, I will specifically only focus on the influence such a practice had within pre-Islamic Arabian cultures. The history of Kiswa tradition, pre-Islamic period. The tradition of covering the Kaaba with a kiswa dates back to the pre-Islamic period, known as Jahiliyyah era, and developed as an expression of respect for the Kaaba. According to tradition, the covering of the Kaaba existed even before Islam, although it is not known exactly who first initiated it. I'd assert that it was quite inevitable that the practice of kiswa was going to be developed within Islam, since the practice of covering cubic structures that were venerated was involved with Muhammad's very own tribe. The Quraysh themselves covered the Kaaba in Mecca when it housed numerous idols. A clear account of this tribal involvement appears in a detailed historical overview from Al-Anba, which is a Kuwaiti daily newspaper that was published on November 28, 2014 in an article titled Between Beauty, Dignity, and Majesty, the story of the Kaaba covering. Moreover, the Quraysh in pre-Islamic times covered the Kaaba. The Arabs in pre-Islamic times covered it with veils, skins, and from the time of the Prophet, the Kaaba was covered with Yemeni clothes. And during the era of Umar and Uthman, may Allah be pleased with them, the Copts from Egypt covered it with special fabric. This should not surprise anyone. Muhammad was not shy to adopt the pagan center of his birthplace, the Kaaba, into his religion, so why not adopt the pagan rituals that surrounded and revolved around it? I mentioned before that Muhammad conquered the structure, and I do want to point out that I was not just using militaristic language for fun. Muhammad really did conquer the structure. Take, for instance, the fact that Muhammad, after preaching for nearly 13 years, had left Mecca after the Muslims were being severely persecuted by the Quraysh tribe, his own people, including assassination attempts. He then migrated to Medina, where he built up the Muslim community, and even fought many battles. Amongst these were Badr and Uhud. After these several years, the Prophet returned to Mecca, and one could potentially say that this was a decisive military campaign, since Muhammad marched 10,000 men back to Mecca, and upon arrival there was minimal resistance. Most Quraysh surrendered or fled after years of broken treaties. The Prophet then ordered the destruction of the idols within the respected site of his tribe, and then dedicated the structure to worship Allah alone. Yet he preserved some of the elements of the pre-Islamic pagan traditions, such as Kiswa and Tawaf, to be kept in practice. I would like to classify these assertions under the correct classification, as it would be important to do so. I guess moving forward, we can refer to such preservation of such pagan concepts as selective adoption. I'd hope that it is not surprising to anyone that even the black stone is a prime example of this selective adaptation, and was revered in pre-Islamic Arabia as a sacred object within the pagan shrine, as it was already part of the Kaaba long before Islam. A prime example being the first ever biography of the Prophets written by Ibn Ishaq. Layth bin Abu Sulaim alleged that they found the stone in the Kaaba 40 years before the Prophet's mission. The tribes of Quraysh gathered stones for the building, each tribe collecting them and building by itself, until the building was finished, up to the black stone. Where controversy arose, each tribe wanting to lift it into its place until they went their several ways, formed alliances, and got ready for battle. The events described by Ibn Ishaq in his biography of the Prophet gives us clear accounts on how the inscribed stone was reportedly found in the Kaaba 40 years before the Prophet's mission began, around 570 CE, near the time of his birth. On that note, I do see it fit to make mention of the numerous accounts of how the Kaaba had gone through major reconstructions done by the Quraysh tribe, Muhammad's own people, including on how he gives account of the fierce dispute over who should be placing the black stone onto the structure. This pre-Islamic reverence for the black stone continued into Islam, where the Prophet preserved it during the conquest of Mecca. This should at this point not surprise anyone, as nothing adjacent to the Kaaba or the black stone is original, but it is worth noting that the practice of istamim, which is the ritual act during the Islamic pilgrimage Hajj of touching or kissing or gesturing towards the black stone, is also deeply rooted within Islam's pagan predecessor. Even the Islamic historian and commentator al-Azraqi makes notes on how even the pagans would perform the practice of embracing and touching kissing stones. For example, describes the pre-Islamic inhabitants of Mecca stroking two idols, named Asaf and Anaila, situated near the Kaaba. Worshippers in Mecca would reportedly perform istalim, the same word used for the ritual of touching and kissing the black stone. This is precisely why Muhammad's very own companions were skeptical of performing istalim themselves to the black stone. Take, for example, a striking hadith that quotes a companion as saying that if he had not seen Muhammad performing the practice, he himself would not have been doing it. Umar came near the black stone and kissed it and said, "No doubt, I know that you are a stone and can neither benefit nor harm anyone. Had I not seen Allah's messenger kissing you, I would not have kissed you." The fact that the companion points out the black stone was merely just a stone and cannot harm nor benefit anyone shows that he was conscious of the idea that this was done to perform acts of veneration or respect to pagan deities / stones. He then declares that if he had not seen the Prophet performing istalim, then he would not have done it himself. Everything to do with the Kaaba is unoriginal. Everything to do with the black stone is unoriginal. The Sunnah of the Prophet is littered with pagan fetishes. Take, for example, that the Quran never once mentions the black stone, Kiswa, or istalim. All we have is the companions being skeptical with their relationship to the age of ignorance. Yet they all went through the process of selective adoption. All the aforementioned practices from pre-Islamic paganism that revolved around the Kaaba and the black stone are still observed and kept in every Hajj, proving that all of these practices that Muhammad adopted selectively are deeply rooted and sourced within Mecca's polytheistic religions and still observed today. I would like to move on from the persistence of pre-Islamic pagan rituals that are still observed within the Islamic religion and turn instead to the stories that predated Islam and are treated as divine fact, as I did touch on some of the compelling evidence that the Quran already borrows directly from human-forged stories of Jesus Christ from the infancy Gospels earlier in this video. So it would be fitting that I make mention on other stories and legends that Muhammad borrowed from, that are within the Quran, being treated as divine revelation from his God. On that note, I do hope that it is not a surprise to anyone that the Quranic story of Dhul Qarnayn or Alexander is nothing more than a borrowed legend and is not original to Islam whatsoever. It comes directly from a Syriac Christian/Jewish legend that predated Islam for centuries. This is not surprising in the slightest, as the Quran already borrows from Syriac Christians quite a lot. Injil is directly taken from the Syriac form of the Greek Evangelion, used by Christians before Islam was a thing. Even the word for Messiah in Arabic, al-Masih, the Messiah, is taken directly from the Syriac word Masiha. Numerous other instances can be found, as the Quran is not a pure Arabic book, as it takes words from the Hebrew/Syriac/Aramaic languages often. But for this case, only the influence of the Syriac language will be addressed in this portion of the chapter. Christians oftentimes use the Syriac language while speaking with Arabs even before Islam was a thing, as it is essential for my case and provides the most direct response for the narrative of Dhul Qarnayn. To start off, it is important that the reader is equipped with the understanding for the reason this figure is even mentioned in the Quran in the first place. Muhammad was merely challenged by a group of poets that were sent by the Jews of Medina to ask Muhammad questions. One of these questions revolved around the figure of Dhul Qarnayn, Alexander the Great. The story of Dhul Qarnayn is Surah Al-Kahf. We know that the story arose because the Quraysh, led by An-Nadr bin Harith, went to see the Jewish rabbis of Medina about the prophethood of Muhammad, and the rabbis gave An-Nadr 3 questions to ask Rasulullah. An-Nadr bin Harith only strengthens our case, as Tafsir Ibn Kathir plainly state that he went to Persia, where the myth had been flourishing for decades prior to Islam being a thing. And whilst he visited, he learned the several stories, some being of heroic kings, and I do not think people need reminding that Alexander the Great had conquered Persia, and in doing so, he had self-proclaimed to be the king of Persia. In Tafsirs of Ibn Kathir on 831 it says, An-Nadr visited Persia and learned the stories of some Persian kings, such as Rastum and Isfandir. When he went back to Mecca, he found that the Prophet was sent from Allah and reciting the Quran to the people. Whenever the Prophets would leave an audience in which An-Nadr was sitting, An-Nadr began narrating to them the stories that he learned in Persia. An-Nadr's exposure to Persian storytelling therefore gives us a unique figure in Islamic history who somewhat is credentialed as an expert, as he was within the same late antique legendary environment from which the Quranic account of Dhul Qarnayn emerges. The Quran is quite clear on how An-Nadr was familiar with the story that Muhammad gave him of Dhul Qarnayn, saying that Muhammad was presenting fables of ancient times. Quran 831 quotes him in this, says, whenever our revelations are cited to him, they challenge you. We already heard the recitation. If we wanted, we could have easily produced something similar. This Quran is nothing but ancient fables. In the tafsir of this verse, Ibn Kathir goes on to say, whenever the prophets would leave an audience in which An-Nadr was sitting, An-Nadr began narrating to them the stories that he had learned in Persia. The meaning of Tales of the Ancients means that the prophet has plagiarized and learned books of ancient people. These facts indicate that An-Nadr bin al-Harith was entirely unimpressed by Muhammad's response to the challenge, and he did not regard it as a successful vindication of his prophetic claims. Having been exposed to mythic and legendary narratives within the Persian cultural environment that surrounded around the Alexander mythos, having addressed the background and historical context of this narrative, it is now appropriate to turn to the specific parallels within the Syriac legend of Alexander the Great. Upon being asked by An-Nadr on who Dhul Qarnayn was, the Quran gives Muhammad's response, saying, in 1831, and they ask you about Dhul Qarnayn. Say, I'll recite to your remembrance. This verse is extremely important because the interpretations that authoritative Muslim tafsir writers give, many Muslims might assert that Dhul Qarnayn is not even about Alexander the Great. Such claims, however, would be put to halt once the authoritative interpretations are addressed. Take, for instance, Jalal al-Jalain, which is considered a highly authoritative and essential classical Sunni commentator. The commentary explicitly attributes Dhul Qarnayn to being a type for Alexander the Great. Jalal al-Jalain goes as follows in 1883, and they question you concerning Dhul Qarnayn, whose name was Alexander. He was not a prophet. Say I shall relate to you a mention of an account of his affairs. This is not surprising and is particularly damaging to the claim of originality, since no historical sources concerning Alexander the Great contain these episodes. Rather, they appear exclusively within legendary and mythological traditions, most notably those preserved in the Syriac Alexander romance, as I will start gradually demonstrating its influence within the Quran. Starting off, we have several parallels within Quran 1885-86, where the Quran seems to be vague in detail, but gets perfectly explained when we harmonize it with its Syriac predecessor, Surah Al-Kahf 85-86. So he traveled a course until he reached the setting point of the sun, which appeared to him to be setting in the spring of murky water, where he found some people. We said, O Dhul Qarnayn, either punish them or treat them kindly. Now compare this with the history of Alexander the Great being the Syriac version, where the legendary goes over the exact event in grave detail, to the point it goes in depth on his traveling a course, until he reached a water where the sun sets into, where it then gives an in-depth account on what the Quran is referring to when it says, either punish them or treat them kindly. The Syriac version of Alexander the Great goes on to say, Now this I desire to go and see, upon what the heavens rest, and what surrounds all creation. The nobles answered and said to the king, Bid us speak. And he commanded them. And they spoke and said unto him, As to the thing, my lord, which thy majesty or thy greatness desires to go and see, namely, upon which the heavens rest, and what surrounds the earth, the terrible seas, which surround the world, will not give thee a passage, because there are 11 bright seas, on which the ships of men sail, and beyond these there are about 10 miles of dry land, and beyond these 10 miles there is the fetid sea, which surrounds all creation. Men are not able to come near to this fetid sea, neither can ships sail thereon, and no bird is able to fly over it. For if a bird should attempt to fly over it, it is caught and falls and is suffocated therein. Its waters are like pus, and if men swim therein, they die at once. And they put ships to sea, and sailed on the sea 4 months and 12 days. And they arrived at the dry land beyond the 11 bright seas. And Alexander and his troops encamped. And he sent and called to him the governor, who was in the camp, and said to him, Are there any men here guilty of death? They said to him, We have 37 men in bonds who are guilty of death. And the king said to the governor, Bring hither those evildoers. And they brought them. And the king commanded them, and said, Go ye to the shore of the fetid sea. And the men went and came to the shore of the sea. Now Alexander thought within himself, If it be true, as they say, that everyone who comes near the fetid sea dies, it is better that these who are guilty of death should die. And when they had gone and had arrived at the shore of the sea, they died instantly. And Alexander and his troops were looking at them when they died, for he and his nobles ridden to see what would happen to them. And they saw that they died the moment they reached the sea. So the whole camp mounted, and Alexander and his troops went up, between the fetid sea and the bright sea, to the place where the sun enters the window of heaven. For the sun is the servant of the Lord, and neither by night nor by day does he cease from his traveling. In the legend that predated Islam, we see that Alexander the Great had a journey to the place of the setting of the sun, where he saw the fetid sea, which it set in. He then gives an account of how rumors circulated on how it is thought that if people were to go near the body of water, they themselves would be killed, which then Alexander orders that evildoers/prisoners condemned with the death penalty should walk to the water to test the myth, which then results in the men being killed. These events is precisely what the Quran touches on when it makes mention of either punish them or treat them kindly. The Quran goes on to say, He responded, Whoever does wrong will be punished by us, then will be returned to their Lord, who will punish them with a horrible torment. As for those who believe and do good, they will have the finest reward, and we will send them easy commands. Then he traveled a different course until he reached the rising point of the sun. He found it rising on a people for whom we had provided no shelter from it. Notice the parallel in both accounts, how Alexander would find the rising place of the sun. The parallel is clearly demonstrated within the aforementioned quotes. These instances are perfect examples for evidence of influence. So the whole camp mounted, and Alexander and his troops went up between the fetid sea and the bright sea to the place where the sun enters the window of heaven, rises up. For the sun is the servant of the Lord, and neither by night nor by day does he cease from his traveling. The Quran goes on to say, Then he traveled a different course until he reached the rising point of the sun. Right? Enters the window of heaven, rising point of the sun. He found it rising on a people for whom we had provided no shelter from it. The Quran talks about a people who live within the region of the rising sun, who had no shelter from presumably the heat, although it is incredibly vague on why it is bad, they do not have a shelter from the sun. Of course, this vagueness again gets explained in depth within the mythos of Alexander the Great, on page 148. To the place where the sun enters the window of heaven, for the sun is the servant of the Lord, and neither by night or by day does he cease from his traveling. The place of his rising is over the sea, and the people who dwell there, when he is about to rise, flee away and hide themselves in the sea, that they be not burnt by his rays. And wherever he passes, there are terrible mountains, and those who dwell there have caves hollowed out in the rocks, and as soon as they see the sun passing over them, men and birds flee away from before him and hide in the caves. Rocks are rent by his blazing heat and fall down, and whether they be men or beasts, as soon as the stones touch them, they are consumed. And when the sun enters the window of heaven, he bows down and makes obedience before God his creator. And he travels and descends the whole night through the heavens, until at length he finds himself where he rises. One who has read the contents of Quran 1890 and the verses leading up to it that give it context will see the striking similarities that it has, as the mythos seems to be giving the Quran extreme detail and harmonizes the material together quite fittingly, like Cinderella's shoe, or fitting like a glove. Whatever one may equivocate it to, it is not overlooked within this video, and shows compelling evidence for influence. Next up, we have the fact that the Quran almost word for word borrows the story of the wall that Alexander the Great builds to protect a people from Gog and Magog. And it is also worth noting that the Quran doesn't seem to hold back in any way, shape, or form, not only preserving the story as divine revelation, but also treats the story as somewhat of an eschatological prophecy. Quran 18:92-100, it goes on to say, Then he traveled a third course until he reached a pass between two mountains. He found in front of them a people who could hardly understand his language. They pleaded, O Zulkarnain, Surely Gog and Magog are spreading corruption throughout the land. Should we pay you tribute, provided that you build a wall between us and them? He responded, What my Lord has provided for me is far better, but assist me with resources. And I will build a barrier between you and them. Bring me blocks of iron. Then when he had filled up the gap between the two mountains, he ordered blow. When the iron became red hot, he said, Bring me molten copper to pour over it. And so the enemies could neither scale nor tunnel through it. He declared, This is a mercy from my Lord. But when the promise of my Lord comes to pass, he will level it to the ground, and my Lord's promise is true. On that day, he will let them surge like waves over one another. Later, the trumpet will be blown, and we will gather all people together. On that day, we will display hell clearly for the disbelievers. The mythos of Alexander the Great goes over these exact events, portraying that a people want a wall that will separate them from a people who are violent, and are even led by figures named Gog and Magog. It even portrays a wall being made from brass and iron that can neither be dug under nor crossed over, that is built between two mountains. In pages 150 to 154 of the Syriac Alexander the Great mythos, it says, Yeah, by your majesty, my lord, the king, neither we nor our fathers have been able to march one step in it, and men do not ascend it, either on that side or on this, for it is the boundary which Gog has set between us and the nations within it. Alexander said, Who are the nations within this mountain? The natives of the land said, They are the Huns. He said to them, Who are their kings? The old men said, Gog and Magog. When Alexander had heard what the old men said, he marveled greatly at the great sea which surrounded all creation. And Alexander said to his troops, Do ye desire that we should do something wonderful in this land? They said to him, As thy majesty commands, we will do. The king said, Let us make a gate of brass and close up this breach. His troops said, As thy majesty commands, we will do. And Alexander commanded and fetched 3,000 smith workers in iron, and 3,000 men workers in brass. And they put down brass and iron, and kneaded it, as a man kneads when he works clay. Then they brought it, and made a gate. And he made a lower threshold from mountain to mountain, and hammered into it the rocks of the mountains. And it was fixed in with brass and iron. And he made an upper threshold from mountain to mountain, and he hammered it into the rocks of the mountains. And he fixed in it 2 bolts of iron, and the bolts went into the rock. And he made 2 bolts of iron from rock to rock behind the gate, and fixed the heads of the bolts into the rocks. He fixed the gates and the bolts, and placed nails of iron, and beat them down one by the other. So that if the Huns came and dug out of the rock, which was under the threshold of iron, even if footmen were able to pass through, a horse with its rider would be unable to pass, so long as the gate that was hammered down with bolts stood. The significance of this parallel cannot be overstated. None of these elements, the mountain pass, the fear of Gog and Magog, the construction of a barrier between 2 mountains, or the use of iron and molten metal to create a structure that can neither be scaled nor tunneled, appear in any historical account of Alexander the Great. Instead, these accounts belong exclusively to mythological Alexander traditions that have been preserved in antique literature. The Quranic account of Dhul-Qarnayn does not originate with Islamic material. This would establish the indication that the Quran was drawn directly from established legendary tradition that was quite known in various regions that surrounded Muhammad. One of the most defining Quran verses for this parallel that I would use to conclude the citing of parallels is Quran 18:84, where we are told in Allah's perspective that he will establish Alexander power on earth. Yusuf Ali, verily we established his power on earth, and we gave him the ways and the means to all ends. Then we have in the history of Alexander the Great in the Syriac version declaring this very thing, but in the perspective of Alexander the Great asking for power. Give me power from thy holy heavens, that I may receive strength greater than the kingdoms of the world, that I may humble them, and I will magnify thy name, O Lord, forever. Pages 146. In both accounts, Alexander's global dominion is not portrayed as the result of military genius alone, but as a power granted to him by the divine. This convergence confirms that the Quranic narrative participates in the same late antique theological mythos that shaped the Syriac Alexander tradition, rather than an independent historical memory or divine revelation from God. The Quranic account of Dhul-Qarnayn, in light of the Syriac Alexander romance, it becomes clear that the narrative is deeply rooted in a pre-Islamic legendary and theological myth that was well developed prior to Islam, in the regions that the religion flourished. With this understanding of Alexander's mythic framework established, we can now turn to another story from Surah Al-Kahf, the same chapter, in chapter 18, which is the same chapter that we covered for the mythos of Alexander the Great. The narrative of the 7 sleepers is also deeply rooted within Christian legends, just like the story of Alexander the Great. There are a great number of clear parallels between the Quranic story of the 7 sleepers and the legend of the 7 sleepers from Ephesus, which is concerning as it was treated as a myth or legend prior to Islam, which makes sense since it predates Islam by centuries. Both stories start with the narrative of 7 youths being in trouble, while in the Quran it seems to be quite vague about the nature of their specific problems. In contrast, the story of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus, just like the aforementioned Alexander the Great mythos, delves deeply on the concepts that gets vaguely touched on the Quran. So much so that when harmonized with its predecessor, we develop an explanation to what the Quran is even referring to. Starting off, we have in verse 10 of chapter 18, "Behold, the youths took themselves into a cave. They said, Our Lord, bestow us mercy from thyself, and dispose of our affair for us in the right way." However, the seven sleepers of Ephesus gives great detail of why they took shelter within the cave. The legend tells specifically of an emperor named Decius, who was forcing Christians to make sacrifices to the pagan gods or else face death. The seven sleepers were born in the city of Ephesus, and when Decius, the emperor, came into Ephesus for the persecution of Christian men, he commanded to edify the temples in the middle of the city, so that all should come with him to do sacrifice to the idols. And did do seek all the Christian people, and bind them, for to make them to do sacrifice, or else put them to death. Another striking yet funny parallel is the fact that some versions of the early Syriac retelling of the seven sleepers of Ephesus, there is some dispute about the time the sleepers were in the cave. Apparently it seems that this disagreement was an issue to Allah as well. The Quran declares that Allah has woken the sleepers as a way to test who could calculate the length of their stay the best. Shakir says in chapter 18:11, "Then we raised them up, that we might know which of the two parties was best able to compute the time for which they remained." The story of the seven sleepers in the Christian mythos says, "It is in doubt of that which is said, that they slept 362 years. For they were raised in the year of our Lord 478, and Decius reigned but 1 year and 3 months. And that was in the year of our Lord 270, and so they slept but 208 years." In the Quranic account, the text asks whether the reader has reflected on the companions of the cave and their inscription. The inclusion of the word inscription is an important detail connecting the story of the Quran with the story of the seven sleepers, because in the Syriac legend, we have more detailed narratives that states that the story of the youth's martyrdom was written and laid near the entrance of the cave. In Quran 18:9, "Or have you thought that the companions of the cave and the inscriptions were among our signs a wonder?" In the Christian mythos of the seven sleepers, it says, "Then Decius thought what he should do with them. As our Lord would, he enclosed the mouth of the cave, wherein they were with stones, to the end that they should die therein for hunger and fault of meat. Then the ministers of the two Christian men, Theodorus and Raphinus, wrote their martyrdom and laid it subtly among the stones." While the Quran does not mention the inscription again, it plays an important role in the Syriac story. The people who discover the sleepers use the inscriptions to verify the truthfulness of the seven men's story. This helps make sense of why the author of the Quran would mention this detail as a part of what the reader should reflect upon. "And Malchus entered first into the cave to his followers, and the bishop next after him. And there they found among the stones the letters sealed with 2 seals of silver. And then the bishop called them that were come thither, and read them before them all, so that they that heard it were all marveled." We also have Ibn Kathir's classic tafsir. Ibn Kathir quotes Sayyad ibn Jubair, saying that the Ar-Rakim was indeed an inscription placed at the entrance of the cave. This confirms the direct connection of the Syriac legend. Ar-Rakim is a tablet stone on which they wrote the story of the people of the cave, and then they placed it at the entrance to the cave. In both accounts, the young men sleep in the cave for hundreds of years and only think they have slept just a day. In Quran 18:19 it says, "And in like manner we awakened them, that they might question one another. A speaker from among them said, How long have ye tarried? They said, We have tarried a day, or spent part of a day. Others said, Your Lord best knoweth what ye have tarried." In the Christian mythos of the seven sleepers it says, "And then these holy saints that were within awoke, and had supposed verily that they had slept but 1 night only, and remembered of the heaviness that they had the day before." Another parallel being the fact that both accounts state that the youth slept for hundreds of years, the Quran stating that it was 300 years, and the Syriac version stating that the number was closer to 200. There's considerable variation in different versions of the seven sleeper legend as to the time frame that they slept, though all of them are no longer than 200 years. In Quran 18:25, "So they stayed in the cave for 300 years, and some had not more." The legend goes on to say, "And so they slept but 208 years. There are several other parallels within Quran chapter 18, but to shorten this chapter, I will recite one last parallel before giving an ultimate conclusion at both the Syriac legend and the Quranic story. At that, both the Syriac legend and the Quranic story state that the youth were awoken as a way to strengthen the faith of believers in the final day of judgment. In Quran 18:21 it says, "Thus did we make their case known to the people, that they might know that the promise of Allah is true, and that there can be no doubt about the hour of judgment." The Christian fable of the seven sleepers goes on to say, "Believe us, for sooth our Lord has raised us before the day of the great resurrection, and to the end, that thou believe firmly the resurrection of the dead people. Verily, we be raised, as ye here see, and alive." Having examined the Quranic account of both Dual Qarnayn and the Seven Sleepers, there is no doubt in my mind that these concepts were deeply rooted within the pre-Islamic legendary and theological myths that were well developed prior to Islam in the regions where the religion flourished. This would conclude that chapter 18 of the Quran is completely infested and littered with late antique Christian legends, particularly from the Syriac traditions. In fact, these verses are treated in the same manner as I am portraying them now. The Quran makes it clear that Muhammad's bystanders were highly critical of where he was getting these stories from in the first place. Take, for instance, the numerous accounts of when the Quran had to deflect from such claims. Take, for instance, the following verses. Chapter 625, the disbelievers would even come to argue with you saying this Quran is nothing but ancient fables. Chapter 831, this Quran is nothing but ancient fables. That was from An-Nadr. Chapter 1624, they say ancient fables. Chapter 25:5, and they say these revelations are only ancient fables, which he has written down, and they are rehearsed among him every morning. Chapter 23:83, we have already been promised this, as well as our forefathers earlier. This is nothing but ancient fables. Chapter 27:68. We have already been promised this, as well as our forefathers earlier. This is nothing but ancient fables. Chapter 46:17. This is nothing but ancient fables. Chapter 68:15. Whenever our revelations are recited to him, he says ancient fables. Chapter 83:13. Whenever our revelations are recited to them, they say ancient fables. The Islamic tradition even records a dramatic rebuttal to similar accusations of human authorship. In Sahih al-Bukhari, a Christian convert who studied Surahs al-Baqarah and al-Imran, chapter 2 and chapter 3, and served as a scribe for the Prophet, later apostatized, claiming Muhammad knew nothing but what he, the Christian, had taught him. There was a Christian who embraced Islam and read Surah al-Baqarah and Surah al-Imran, and he used to write for the Prophet. Later on, he returned to Christianity again, and he used to say Muhammad knows nothing but what I've taught him. Then Allah caused him to die.
At the starting of the week, I'd tell me talk